When someone gets diagnosed with high blood pressure, the advice they receive is almost automatic. Cut out the salt. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. It is simple. It feels actionable. You can start doing it today. But here is the uncomfortable truth that most people are never told. For a large portion of the people following that advice, it is either incomplete at best or pointing them in entirely the wrong direction at worst. Not because salt is irrelevant, it does play a role for some people, but because salt is only one small piece of a much larger and much more important picture. And when you spend all your energy reducing sodium while ignoring the real drivers of your elevated blood pressure, you are working hard and getting a fraction of the results you should be seeing. Worse, you end up on medication long-term for a condition that in many cases can be fully reversed by addressing the actual root causes. In this video, we are going to go through the real and often overlooked causes of high blood pressure that affect the vast majority of people with this diagnosis. We are going to explain the precise mechanisms behind each one, and we are going to give you a clear, evidence-based action plan for bringing your blood pressure down naturally, in many cases without needing medication long-term. If you have been diagnosed with high blood pressure, or if you are watching your numbers creep up and want to get ahead of it, this video has the information you need. Part 1. Why the salt advice is incomplete. Let us start with sodium itself, because understanding its actual role in blood pressure will help you understand why the one-size-fits-all advice to cut salt often misses the mark. Here is how sodium affects blood pressure. When sodium levels in the blood rise, water follows sodium. The body retains more fluid, blood volume increases, and that increased volume creates more pressure inside the arteries. That part of the sodium story is true. But what the standard advice almost never explains is what happens next in a healthy body. When blood pressure rises due to sodium intake, healthy kidneys sense that increase almost immediately. In response, they increase the excretion of sodium and water in the urine. As the excess fluid is eliminated, blood volume comes down and blood pressure returns to normal. This mechanism is called pressure natriuresis, and it works remarkably well in people with healthy kidney function and good metabolic health. This is why a large percentage of people can eat a relatively high sodium diet without developing chronic high blood pressure. Their kidneys are doing their job efficiently. The system self-regulates. And this is why there is such enormous variability in how people respond to sodium. Some people are genuinely sodium sensitive and see meaningful reductions in blood pressure from cutting salt. Others are largely sodium resistant, and their blood pressure barely moves regardless of how much salt they eat. So when blood pressure stays persistently elevated despite cutting sodium, the kidneys are telling you something important. The problem is not the sodium you are eating. The problem is why your kidneys are not eliminating it efficiently. And that is where the real causes of high blood pressure begin to appear. Part 2. Magnesium Deficiency. One of the most common and most underdiagnosed contributors to high blood pressure is magnesium deficiency. And the reason this matters so much is that magnesium plays a central and irreplaceable role in regulating blood vessel tone. Magnesium works in the vascular system by supporting the production of nitric oxide and prostacyclin, two compounds that cause blood vessel walls to relax and widen. When magnesium levels are adequate, blood vessels maintain their natural elasticity and tone, allowing blood to flow with appropriate pressure. When magnesium is low, blood vessels tend to stay in a more constricted state than they should, and that constriction directly elevates blood pressure. The scale of magnesium deficiency in the population is genuinely alarming. Conservative estimates suggest that close to half of the adults in the United States do not get enough magnesium through their diet. And a meta-analysis of 22 studies found a clear and consistent relationship between lower magnesium levels and higher odds of having high blood pressure. The lower the magnesium, the higher the risk. There are two main reasons why magnesium deficiency has become so widespread. The first is the quality of the modern diet. Magnesium is found primarily in leafy green vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains. A diet dominated by processed foods, refined flour products, and added sugars is dramatically lower in magnesium than a diet based on whole foods. And eating large amounts of sugar actively makes the problem worse, because excess sugar increases urinary excretion of magnesium. The kidneys flush magnesium out in response to the metabolic stress of high sugar intake, depleting your stores even further. The second reason is less obvious, but equally important. Modern agricultural practices have progressively reduced the mineral content of soil over the past several decades. The same foods that provided robust amounts of magnesium a generation ago now contain meaningfully less of it because the soil they were grown in is increasingly depleted. This means that even people eating a generally healthy whole food diet may be getting less magnesium from their food than the nutritional tables suggest. The practical interventions for addressing magnesium deficiency are twofold. The first is dietary. Prioritize magnesium-rich whole foods every day. Dark leafy greens including spinach, Swiss chard, and kale. Legumes including black beans, edamame, and lentils. Nuts, particularly almonds, cashews, and pumpkin seeds. And whole grains where tolerated. These should be consistent daily features of your diet. The second intervention is supplementation. Given the widespread nature of magnesium deficiency and the limitations of food sources due to soil depletion, many people genuinely benefit from a magnesium supplement. A meta-analysis of 38 randomized controlled trials found that magnesium supplementation at a median dose of 365 milligrams per day for 12 weeks produced small but meaningful reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. In people who already had high blood pressure and were taking medication, the reduction was even greater, with systolic blood pressure dropping by almost 8 millimeters of mercury in some studies. That is a clinically significant effect from a mineral that most people are simply not getting enough of. If you are considering a magnesium supplement, the form matters. Magnesium glycinate and magnesium malate are generally well absorbed and well tolerated. Magnesium oxide, which is the cheapest and most common form, is poorly absorbed. Magnesium citrate is effective but has a laxative effect at higher doses. And magnesium threonate has shown particular promise for cognitive benefits alongside blood pressure support. Discuss the appropriate form and dose with your doctor. Part 3. Insulin resistance and high blood pressure. Here is the connection that most people with high blood pressure are never told about, and it may be the single most important piece of information in this video. Insulin resistance is one of the most powerful and most underappreciated drivers of chronically elevated blood pressure. To understand why, you need to understand something about how the kidneys handle sodium that goes beyond the basic explanation. The kidneys have insulin receptors, and when insulin levels are elevated, the kidneys respond by retaining sodium rather than excreting it. They essentially hold on to sodium that they would otherwise have eliminated. And when the kidneys hold on to sodium, they hold on to water along with it. Blood volume increases, blood pressure goes up. This is happening independently of how much sodium you are eating. You could be following a strict, low-sodium diet and still have chronically elevated blood pressure driven by high insulin, because the insulin is telling your kidneys to retain whatever sodium is present regardless of dietary intake. This is why cutting salt often produces disappointing results in people who are insulin resistant or pre-diabetic. The sodium is not the primary driver. The insulin is. And here is the scale of this problem. Insulin resistance affects somewhere between 70 and 88% of adults in the United States to some degree. It is not a rare condition. It is the dominant metabolic state of the adult population. And almost everyone in that group has elevated baseline insulin levels, driving a degree of sodium retention and elevated blood pressure that dietary sodium reduction alone cannot adequately address. This is also why high blood pressure is so strongly associated with type 2 diabetes. It is not coincidental. Both conditions are driven by the same underlying metabolic dysfunction. When insulin resistance is addressed, blood pressure in many cases comes down dramatically, often before any significant weight is lost and before any change in sodium intake. The insulin drops, the kidneys stop retaining sodium. Blood volume normalizes. Pressure drops. This can happen within weeks of meaningful dietary change. Fructose enters this picture in a specific and important way. When you consume large amounts of fructose from added sugars, processed foods, and sweetened beverages, your body produces elevated levels of uric acid as a byproduct of fructose metabolism. And high uric acid is an independent driver of high blood pressure through a mechanism that is completely separate from insulin resistance. Uric acid interferes with nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide, as we discussed in the magnesium section, is one of the primary compounds responsible for keeping blood vessels relaxed and dilated. When uric acid is high, nitric oxide function is impaired. Blood vessels become stiffer, and the kidneys become less efficient at excreting sodium, further compounding the blood pressure problem. High uric acid is also the primary cause of gout, and if you or someone you know has gout alongside high blood pressure, this metabolic connection explains why they so often appear together. There is a medication called allopurinol that is commonly used to lower uric acid for gout, and research has shown that it also tends to reduce blood pressure in people whose hypertension is being driven by elevated uric acid levels. But the most powerful and most sustainable intervention is dietary. Cut out the fructose that is driving uric acid up in the first place. The dietary changes that address both insulin resistance and high uric acid simultaneously are the same changes. Dramatically reduce or eliminate added sugars and sweetened beverages. Replace refined carbohydrates with whole food sources of carbohydrate. Eat adequate protein and healthy fats. These changes lower insulin, lower uric acid, improve kidney sodium handling, reduce blood pressure, and improve metabolic health across the board. Part 4. Potassium Deficiency. If magnesium is the underappreciated mineral in the blood pressure conversation, potassium is the almost entirely ignored one. And the research on potassium and blood pressure is compelling and consistent. Potassium works on blood pressure through two primary mechanisms. The first is in the kidneys and blood vessels. Potassium directly tells the kidneys to excrete sodium in the urine. It is a physiological counterbalance to sodium's blood pressure-raising effect. More potassium means the kidneys eliminate sodium more efficiently, which reduces blood volume and lowers pressure. Potassium also helps blood vessel walls relax, reducing vascular resistance and contributing to lower blood pressure directly. The second mechanism is in the nervous system. When potassium levels rise, particularly in the central nervous system and the cerebrospinal fluid, it suppresses the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system. The sympathetic nervous system is a primary driver of elevated blood pressure under stress. By calming sympathetic activity, higher potassium levels help quiet the nervous system's contribution to elevated blood pressure. Here is the dietary reality that makes this matter so much. The modern Western diet is dramatically imbalanced in the sodium to potassium ratio. Our ancestors consumed diets where potassium intake was substantially higher than sodium intake. The modern diet is almost exactly the opposite. High in processed foods loaded with sodium, low in fresh vegetables, legumes, and whole fruits that are the primary sources of potassium. This imbalance alone is sufficient to push blood pressure upward even when absolute sodium intake does not look particularly high on paper. When you combine low potassium with high insulin and high uric acid and low magnesium, you have created what researchers describe as the perfect storm for sodium retention. Every mechanism that would normally balance blood pressure and keep sodium moving out through the kidneys is disrupted simultaneously. And cutting sodium at that point is addressing only one small dimension of a multi-dimensional problem. The foods richest in potassium that are practical and accessible for daily consumption include root vegetables like sweet potatoes and regular potatoes, vine vegetables like tomatoes, cucumbers, and eggplant, leafy greens like spinach and Swiss chard, legumes including lentils, chickpeas, and black beans, and avocados. Many of these foods also happen to be rich in magnesium, so targeting them strategically addresses two deficiencies simultaneously. A note on potassium supplementation. Unlike magnesium, high-dose potassium supplementation can be genuinely dangerous, particularly for people with kidney disease or people taking certain medications, including ACE inhibitors, ARBs, or potassium-sparing diuretics. High blood potassium, called hyperkalemia, can cause dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. Do not supplement potassium without discussing it with your doctor. Getting potassium from whole food sources is safe for most people and is the recommended approach. Part 5. Additional drivers. Most doctors do not check. The nutrient deficiencies and metabolic factors we have covered account for the majority of cases of high blood pressure that are not being adequately addressed by sodium reduction alone. But there are several additional drivers that deserve mention because they are frequently overlooked even by physicians. Vitamin D deficiency is strongly associated with high blood pressure. Vitamin D receptors are present in the kidneys and in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is the hormonal system that regulates blood pressure and fluid balance. When vitamin D is low, this system tends to be overactivated, promoting sodium retention and elevated blood pressure. Given that vitamin D deficiency affects somewhere between 40 and 97% of adults globally depending on geography, this is not a minor issue. Getting your vitamin D levels tested and addressing deficiency either through sun exposure or supplementation is a reasonable step for anyone managing blood pressure. Chronic psychological stress is another driver that is consistently underestimated. The stress response, mediated through cortisol in the sympathetic nervous system, raises blood pressure acutely as part of the fight-or-flight response. But when stress is chronic and ongoing, as it so often is in modern life, blood pressure can remain persistently elevated as a baseline state. Stress also promotes inflammatory eating patterns, disrupts sleep, and increases cortisol, which contributes to insulin resistance and further compounds the metabolic drivers of elevated blood pressure. Sleep disruption is directly connected to blood pressure regulation. During normal healthy sleep, blood pressure naturally dips by 10 to 20% in a process called nocturnal dipping. This nightly reduction in blood pressure gives the cardiovascular system recovery time and is associated with lower rates of heart attack and stroke. People with poor sleep, whether from insomnia, sleep apnea, or chronic insufficient sleep duration, often lose this nocturnal dip. Their blood pressure remains elevated around the clock rather than recovering during sleep. Obstructive sleep apnea is a particularly important and frequently undiagnosed cause of treatment-resistant high blood pressure. If you snore heavily, wake frequently at night, feel unrefreshed in the morning, or have a partner who has observed you stopping breathing during sleep, getting evaluated for sleep apnea is worth prioritizing. And finally, a condition called primary aldosteronism deserves mention because it is far more common than most people realize. Primary aldosteronism is a hormonal disorder where the adrenal glands produce too much of a hormone called aldosterone, which directly causes the kidneys to retain sodium and excrete potassium. It is estimated to be responsible for somewhere between 8 and 20% of cases of resistant high blood pressure, meaning blood pressure that does not respond well to standard medication. If your blood pressure is difficult to control despite medication and a good dietary approach, asking your doctor to test your aldosterone and renin levels is reasonable. Part 6, the action plan. Let us consolidate everything into a practical action plan because the purpose of understanding all of these mechanisms is to give you specific and actionable steps you can start taking now. Step 1 is to eliminate or dramatically reduce added sugar in sweetened beverages. This is the single highest leverage change for most people with high blood pressure because it simultaneously addresses insulin resistance, uric acid elevation, and magnesium depletion. The evidence for rapid blood pressure improvements from sugar reduction is consistent and clinically meaningful. People who make this change and stick with it often see measurable improvements in their blood pressure within 2 to 4 weeks. Step 2 is to increase your potassium and magnesium intake through food. Target sweet potatoes, leafy greens, legumes, avocados, nuts, and seeds as daily dietary staples. These foods address both deficiencies simultaneously and provide fiber, antioxidants, and other nutrients that support overall metabolic health. Step 3 is to evaluate your magnesium status and consider supplementation. Discuss this with your doctor and ask for a red blood cell magnesium test if possible, which is more accurate than standard serum magnesium for detecting deficiency. If you are deficient, a well-absorbed form of magnesium supplement taken daily can produce meaningful blood pressure reductions within weeks. Step 4 is to exercise consistently. Regular aerobic exercise improves insulin sensitivity, reduces sympathetic nervous system activity, improves endothelial function, and produces direct and sustained reductions in blood pressure. 30 to 45 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity on most days of the week is associated with systolic blood pressure reductions of 5 to 8 millimeters of mercury in people with hypertension. That is comparable to some blood pressure medications. Step 5 is to prioritize sleep. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep per night is not optional for blood pressure management. If your sleep is consistently disrupted or non-restorative, addressing the cause of that disruption should be treated as a medical priority, not a lifestyle nicety. Step 6 is to manage stress through consistent practice. Breathing exercises, meditation, time in nature, and regular physical activity all reduce sympathetic nervous system activity and lower baseline cortisol. The blood pressure benefits of consistent stress management practice are well documented and begin accumulating within weeks of starting. And step 7 is to have a conversation with your doctor about testing your vitamin D, uric acid, and aldosterone levels if your blood pressure is not responding as expected to dietary and lifestyle changes. These are not exotic tests. They are standard blood markers that can reveal treatable causes of resistant high blood pressure that standard care frequently misses. The bottom line: high blood pressure is rarely caused by one thing. It is almost always the cumulative result of multiple small physiological stresses that compound over time. Magnesium deficiency, insulin resistance, elevated uric acid, potassium deficiency, vitamin D deficiency, poor sleep, chronic stress. Each one contributes. Together, they can create a level of blood pressure elevation that makes long-term medication seem like the only answer, when in reality the root causes are addressable through diet, supplementation, and lifestyle. The salt advice is not wrong, but it is one small piece of a much larger picture that you now understand. Use that understanding to work on the real drivers. And if you are on blood pressure medication, do not stop it on your own. Work with your doctor to monitor your numbers as you make these changes. Many people who address the root causes find that their medication needs to be reduced over time as their blood pressure normalizes. That is the goal. Not just managing a number, actually fixing